And good Thursday afternoon to you. I'm Devin Dwyer at ABC News in Washington. Welcome to the briefing room. Great to have White House correspondent Tara Palmieri with us, State Department reporter Connor Finnegan here as well. And it is snowing down here in Washington. Hope you're staying warm wherever you are. Take a live look now at the Capitol. Look at that. We are in full-on blizzard. They said wintry mix, and we got wintry mix. And of course, Congress is in town today. They're hard at work underneath the dome there. Also trying to stay warm today and digesting the news out of Saudi Arabia this morning. A big headline involving the death of Washington Post journalist, columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered last month in Turkey by Saudi officials. The Saudi prosecutor, after conducting an investigation this morning, announced that they have indicted 11 Saudis and recommended a death sentence for 5 of them in connection with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. They said it was a rendering gone wrong. He was drugged, dismembered. Some pretty gruesome details there. Connor Finnegan, you've been following this story. One thing that struck me was this official finding from Saudi said that MBS, the Crown Prince, had no knowledge of this whatsoever.
Right.
Does that hold water? What are U.S. officials saying?
That's something that U.S. officials do not agree with. Privately, State Department officials may not go that far, but we've heard a lot from Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill that clearly everything that happens in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia must happen either with the consent or at least the oversight of the Crown Prince. A young guy, but he's really consolidated power behind his father, King Salman. And it's clear that he had it out for not just Jamal Khashoggi, but many of his critics abroad. And so this operation that was underway, it's hard to believe it didn't happen without him. And part of the problem for the Saudis is that their story continues to change. As you mentioned, now finally revealing or admitting that he was dismembered, that there was an intention to kill him right away when he entered the consulate in Istanbul. That flies in the face of everything that they said before.
Right.
So some transparency. Tara, the White House has said they want full transparency. At least they've paid lip service to that, knowing that Saudi Arabia is a pretty delicate ally the Trump administration has tried to defend.
Right. The actions right now from the Treasury, we saw 17 people from Saudi Arabia issued sanctions, and their visas were revoked, I believe, as well.
So that was another major headline.
That was
today,
a major headline,
sanctions.
but the issue is that among them are the 11 people that were indicted from Saudi Arabia. So you're basically sanctioning people who are going to jail.
All 17 of them are actually already in custody in Saudi Arabia.
They're already behind bars and they're
Exactly.
sanctions. And so, in fact, let's just put it up. We've got a tweet from Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Here you're seeing some of the highlights of the sanctions. As just said, the 15-man team that went into Istanbul to murder Jamal Khashoggi has been sanctioned.
Importantly, too, the Consul General in Istanbul, the man who oversees that consulate, is among those being sanctioned now as well. And a senior advisor to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, someone who's very close to him, a man named Saud Qahtani, who's really had a fall from grace, who's been one of the real scapegoats in this entire episode, was probably directed by the Crown Prince to carry this out and has now become one of the fall men for it.
Right, but to actually sanction the Crown Prince, which some see as the real true punishment to Saudi
the brains
Arabia.
behind the operation.
Oh, that would completely
hasn't been
destroy
touched.
our relationship between Saudi Arabia. It would end diplomatic relationships.
And critics on Capitol Hill, of course, are calling all of this out. Rand Paul, a close friend of the president, Republican senator from Kentucky, made this observation on Twitter just a little while ago. He says the United States needs to project strength when dealing with Saudi Arabia. Putting sanctions, as Connor was just saying, on people who are already in jail means nothing. These individuals might lose their heads. You think they care? We're pretending to do something and we're doing nothing. I guess that puts the question on the table: what more can or will the Trump administration do beyond sanction these people that are already behind bars?
Yeah, that's right. How high are they willing to go? The problem, though, is that the Saudis have now laid out a case where the deputy intelligence chief is really the one they say is responsible for initiating this entire operation. They've created this sort of chain of command, and they're now holding all of those people responsible. There's 21 of them in total that are in custody. And so far, the U.S. hasn't contrasted with that narrative. They've not done anything to target people outside of that chain of command and move beyond it. Whether or not they're willing to do that is the big question now. As Tara said, it could have really dire implications for the relationship with Saudi Arabia.
And the president has yet to weigh in, Tara, on the latest developments today, certainly, but given any hint of what further he might want to see done to Saudi with respect to this.
Right. You saw the president really could not handle the pressure, especially from the press, the Washington Post, day after day, the headlines. He actually called a Washington Post reporter to try to clarify that he was taking this death seriously. But, he did come out off the bat from the beginning saying we don't want to cut arms sales with Saudi Arabia. That's something that Rand Paul has called for. And so at the end of the day, the president says that he doesn't want to lose millions of jobs. The actual figures are quite minimal when you think about it, but he's clearly thinking of business interests before diplomatic
And we'll
relations.
see much more to come on this story. I think the next shoe to drop will be up on Capitol Hill, where the Senate is still reacting, digesting this news today, and as Tara was alluding to, potentially arms sales on the table, some action there before the end of the year. Meanwhile, speaking of the Senate and those two contested Senate races, which we're still waiting the results from Tuesday's election a week ago, though they're still in flux down in Florida. What a mess down there. Let's bring in our political reporter, Chris Good, who is tracking all the developments. In fact, we have just recently passed a state-mandated 3 o'clock Thursday deadline, Chris, for the recount to be finished, the results to be certified. So where do things stand?
That's right, and they didn't make it. Not all counties have completed their recounting by a 3 p.m. deadline. Here's what's going on in Florida. You've got two races, a governor's race that's separated. It's very close. It's separated a little bit more widely than the very, very close Senate race. That's 0.15 percentage points between sitting Senator Bill Nelson, a Democrat, Governor Rick Scott, the Republican, challenging him. They've been recounting votes. Counties had until 3 p.m. today to finish. And Palm Beach County, a key Democratic county in South Florida, did not make the deadline. They'd had problems with their machines this week. Machines had overheated, stopped functioning. And the supervisor of elections in that county just said not very long ago, we didn't make it. We tried our best.
So what happens if they don't make it? Does that mean the original results from Tuesday's election stand as they originally were in that particular race?
Well, here's the thing. They're still counting votes. There's recounting and then there's counting. There's still an unknown number of overseas and military ballots coming into Florida. People who live overseas, people who are active duty military, who need to vote by mail because they're not in their home county. They have until Friday to have their ballots returned. That's tomorrow. So counties really will continue counting one way or another until Sunday. It's unlikely we'll get a result of any official kind until Sunday. Meanwhile, what's happening today, regardless of whether all counties finish counting, in the meantime, we're on our way to a manual recount. The race is close enough that now they'll have some ballots set aside that counties will have to go through by hand and try to examine between now and Sunday.
And that you're talking about is the Senate race, which is between Rick Scott, the Republican, Bill Nelson, the incumbent Democrat. That's very, very close. But is your sense, Chris, that the governor's race is pretty much going to be settled? That won't go to a hand recount.
The governor's race will likely not go to a hand recount. There's a state threshold. The race has to be within 0.25 percentage points. The governor's race is currently outside that. So, Mayor Andrew Gillum has said we need to count every vote. And as I mentioned, there's an unknown number of votes yet to come in from military and overseas voters, but it appears much less likely that that race will go to a manual recount.
All right, we're inching towards a conclusion in Florida. Chris, thanks so much. Let's take a look at where things stand in the battle for the Senate, just for those keeping score at home. The big picture here, we went into election night with 51-47 control for Republicans in the United States Senate, but there are two races undecided. We've been talking about Florida, the Bill Nelson, Rick Scott race, but of course, Tara, there is a pretty wild race playing out in Mississippi.
Yep.
You've kept some eyes on that. It's
Right.
surprisingly close. There's a runoff coming up.
Right.
Mike Espy, former Clinton official, Democrat,
Yep.
running against Cindy Hyde-Smith, the Republican. She was backed by President Trump.
Right, exactly. And we knew this was coming. This isn't a surprise, but it's just more of the midterms playing out. And I think the indications show, though, that the Republican Hyde-Smith has a lead right now. But if Democrats are able to pull this out of their hat,
Boy,
I mean,
that would be something.
Right,
in red
exactly.
Mississippi, it was very close. The whole reason it's a runoff, of course, is because neither candidate on November 6th was able to reach the 50% threshold. They were both in the 40s. So here we are, something to track coming up just after Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, on the House side of the equation, the battle has been heating up for who is going to lead the House Democrats in their new majority. We've been following it closely this week as Nancy Pelosi has defiantly asserted that she will be the next Speaker of the House, but a growing number of Democrats in her party saying not so fast. Let's bring in our House reporter Ben Siegel, who joins us from Capitol Hill. He's been tracking that development. And Ben, we're getting word now that some Democrats are coming out of the woodwork to challenge her, Nancy Pelosi, potentially for Speaker. Tell us what you're hearing.
That's right, Devin. One of the biggest developments up here the last 24 hours is that Marcia Fudge, a Democrat from Ohio, a former leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, has said that she's considering running against Nancy Pelosi to challenge her to be Speaker in that race. She's taking up the call that this small but very determined band of Pelosi critics in the House have been calling for. They want new leadership. It's a mix of current members and a few incoming Democrats, some of the majority makers who ran on a call for new leadership. So she's listening to those calls. She has not notably declared that she's running for Pelosi. That's something that Nancy Pelosi, her aides, and her supporters, of which there are many in the House, have pointed out that Fudge is not quite in the race. But look, I think it's still a numbers game for Nancy Pelosi. She's the favorite, and it's hers to lose.
Well, we'll talk about the numbers in a second, but here's what Nancy Pelosi had to say earlier today when asked about this growing number of Democrats opposing her. Take a listen.
I have overwhelming support in my caucus to be Speaker of the House, and certainly we have many, many people in our caucus who could serve in this capacity. I happen to think that at this point, I'm the best person for that.
What do you make of Marcia Fudge trying to challenge you or considering challenge?
Say to everybody, come on in, the water's warm.
The water is warm, Ben. Marcia Fudge dipping her toe. Who else are you hearing up there? What are people whispering about? Who else could be joining her in an actual public challenge to Pelosi?
Well, what's interesting is that after Marcia Fudge said she's considering this, another name that you hear being thrown around is Karen Bass, a Democrat from California, another member of the Black Caucus. She's somebody who some of these anti-Pelosi folks have floated as a alternative. She came out today on Twitter to support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. So it's very much a scramble behind the scenes right now for Nancy Pelosi and her team to make sure that they can limit the number of critics, and for the anti-Pelosi folks to make sure they can stick together in large enough numbers to deny her the gavel.
And of course, Tara, this is a huge story both because Nancy Pelosi is a political icon and someone everybody in this country knows, whether you like her or hate her, but also because, and you're certainly a student of this town, the Speaker of the House is an incredibly powerful, influential, critical position in a government. It's in the line of succession.
Right, and President Trump certainly has made a big part of his midterm campaign to make Nancy Pelosi the boogeyman. But the dirty little secret in the White House is that they rather work with the devil they know than the devil they don't know, and that he would rather work with Nancy Pelosi than with an unknown player.
Interesting. And so Nancy Pelosi is the person, or whoever is the next Speaker of the Democratic House, determines the legislative agenda, basically drives the train for Democrats, and will be sort of leading the charge and holding President Trump accountable.
And she's willing to make deals, and that's how President Trump views her, as a deal maker.
One reason why he wants her. Right, exactly. So we'll keep our eyes on that, and our thanks to Ben Siegel for his reporting up on Capitol Hill. Finally today, what's the president thinking about, Tara? He is simply being mysterious, I think is a good word this week. He's limited his public appearances. He's tweeting sort of at a higher rate than usual, perhaps, and today he's back to talking a lot about Bob Mueller.
Right, which has suggested that there's going to be some sort of activity. If there is going to be activity on that front, it would likely happen tomorrow before the Thanksgiving holiday break. Usually these indictments come down at the end of the week on a Friday, late afternoon. Everybody should be watching ABC News.
So we've sort of picked up on a pattern that when the president comes back around, I think something like 6 tweets today, he tweeted on Bob Mueller. The special counsel investigate. He said the inner workings are simply nuts.
Well, he's in the process of answering the questions. His questions were sent over to his lawyers. He met with his lawyer Rudy Giuliani, Jay Sekulow last night. They talked about the questions that Mueller asked him, and he's clearly getting some information about what they're looking into based on those questions.
And what you just spoke to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead attorney in this matter. What is Rudy Giuliani saying about those questions, about what Bob Mueller wants to know from the president in writing?
Well, he hasn't really given away much about that because it would give away what would be in the report, essentially. But I think you can take from the president's tweets that he's not too happy about it. Mayor Giuliani told me that, the president is upset but not angry. He wants to know when this is going to wrap up. He actually said he didn't like the way that Paul Manafort, his former aide, is being treated. He was indicted. All we can do really is talk to his attorneys and look to the tweets, because the president has been a little cryptic about this, but our sources say that he's unhappy with the questions.
And Fridays are always big days in this town, both at the White House and the Mueller investigation at the State Department. So we are closely tracking developments tomorrow, of course. The White House also just announcing, by the way, guys, that President Trump will travel to California, rare trip to California to visit with victims from the wildfires there on Saturday.
Is that the first time he's traveled to California as president?
Not the first time. He did do a fundraiser, but certainly the first time to visit victims of any
to the border in
disaster.
California
Went to the
as well.
border as well.
Right, okay. See the
But
Prototype.
he's been criticized for not going out there for numerous forest fires, the shooting there at the borderline, at the Country Western Bar just a week or so ago. So we'll see what happens on Saturday. Meanwhile, everybody in this town's bundled up. We'll take a closing picture as we leave you today of the White House. They're wrapped in snow. Join us tomorrow in the briefing room here. I'm Devin Dwyer, Tara Palmieri. Great to have Connor Finnegan with us. We'll see you next time.